Give people a little bit of time to show up.
Sure.
And then I'm going to play the brief intro, and then well, welcome to a special edition of The Underneath. We have a live stream today with my good friend here, Larry Chapp. Larry, you are in Rome. I am so excited to sort of pick your brain. Like, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What's the vibe on the street, as it were? And anyway, how you doing, man? What's up?
I'm doing pretty well, except for the lingering effects of a head cold I picked up while traveling, which always happens to me. So for the viewers, well, I only mention that not to gain pity, but if I start coughing a bit, then hopefully you'll understand.
And I'll do my best, of course, to sort of carry us through any extended coughing fits today. So, yeah. Well, here we are. We're in the middle of the week. Last weekend, we saw Pope Francis at the funeral, buried, and now we're on to phase next, right? I guess this is sort of the lead up to the conclave. But before we jump into the conclave, anything you want to, what did you see at the funeral, in and around the Vatican throughout all that?
Well, one of the things that struck me about the funeral is that in one sense, there were more people there than I kind of expected to see.
Yeah.
I think the Vatican estimate was there were about 250,000 people in St. Peter's Square, and that seems about right to me. It was pretty crowded.
Yeah.
And of course, Cardinal Casper just came out a few days ago and says, the people of God have spoken.
Yes.
We need Francis Part 2 because there were so many people at the funeral. Well, there were 2 million people at John Paul II's funeral, but Walter Casper wasn't ringing that bell back then. Now, I will say this, though, however, with regard to what I saw at the funeral, I talked to a lot of people there, and it turns out I noticed there were a lot of young people there. The canonization of Carlo Acutis was supposed to take place. And then Pope Francis passed away, and so the canonization was canceled. But a lot of people already had their bookings, their tickets, their hotel rooms, and so they came anyway or were already there. And so I think that, and I don't say this to be mean-spirited.
No, I understand.
That many people have, but I do believe that maybe about 30% of the crowd was there because they were there for the Carlo Acutis canonization, and probably wouldn't have gone to the papal funeral otherwise. And so I think that is somewhat important because it speaks to the narrative that somehow Pope Francis was this wonderfully popular pope, that he was the people's pope, that everyone loved Pope Francis and so forth. I don't think that's true. I think that's a false narrative.
Yeah, I do too. I think Pope Francis, I mean, again, popular with, who is he popular with? Who is he not popular with? And I think that's a worthy conversation. And I'm not interested in being mean for the sake of being mean, but I do think it's an important question to ask. I think it's important to pose, and really it's, who is he popular with? Well, in my own sort of, take my anecdotal evidence for what it's worth, Larry. But for my own experience, there's an inverse correlation with those people who go to mass at least once a week or even more versus those that, occasionally go. Maybe they are sort of culturally conditioned to go or they don't go at all. And for those people who don't go at all, they loved this pope. And I'm not sure what to make of that. Well, what do you think I'm correct about that? Is that your experience?
I was just about to say that who he's popular with are people who don't go to church or go very infrequently, or even non-believers, because they perceived him as a liberalizer. They perceived him as somebody who was saying, oh, don't worry about your sins. It's no big deal. Everybody that's harping about sin are just a bunch of Pharisees. Right. And so on. And that resonates with a lot, but it's not a message that's going to move people to go to church. That's the thing. If Pope Francis's message of radical inclusion and todos, everyone, and don't judge, if that led to a vast swarm of converts to the church, I'd say, well, looky there. He
Yeah.
had his finger on the pulse of something important all along.
Yeah.
But it hasn't led to massive conversions in the church. All it has led to was people saying, yeah, that's great. He seems like a nice avuncular man that I could sit down and have a beer with, but it's not going to bring me back to church.
Yeah. And, and I would just add on to that. There's nothing wrong with feeling like you can have a beer with the Pope, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like that's fine. I happen to think that you could have had a beer with Benedict or John Paul II. I don't know about Paul VI. That'd be an interesting. I don't know enough about sort of his. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is here what is the Pope, right? I think is the question, right? What is the Pope? What is the function of the papacy? And what is needed at this time, right? So I think that the fact that, he's been laid to rest and all of the nice lords can no longer have that, sort of cudgel with which to beat us over the head with, I think now is, of course, absolutely the time to talk about the Pope's legacy, because in order to look forward, you have to, I think, have a sober and clear-eyed sense of what has just happened in the last 12 years.
Oh, absolutely. To answer your immediate question, what is the role of the Pope?
Yep.
As I've said many times in various articles, the basic, simplest way to describe the role of the Pope is that his job is to unify the church by clarifying matters of dispute.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he's like the court of last appeal. And historically, this is the way the papacy's always operated. The life of the church spins around as it always does in its day-to-day business. Controversies arise. Oftentimes bishops just deal with it on the local level, but every once in a while, a major question raises its head in the church, a question of theology, a question of church practice, and it can't be resolved. And so the job of the Pope is then to step in and say, here's the answer. This is what we're going to do. This is what keeps the Catholic Church together. The center holds. We're not Anglicans. We're not Orthodox. Right. Those communions have their strengths, but one of them is not unity.
Right.
Okay. They're fractious.
Well, I've noticed that there's a faction or a group of people who are poo-pooing the idea of unity. I wonder what you made of Czerny's remark about that.
Yeah.
Cardinal Czerny.
Well, that's just... Of course, it's a nonsensical statement that he made, because this is the role of the Pope. The role of the Pope is not to sow the seeds of division. For crying out loud, what an ignoramus statement to make, that unity is not the goal, when it is the very function of the Pope to bring unity to the church. The Pope is not simply an oracle on the Tiber who is a generator of ever new creative ideas that the rest of the church gets to chew on and munch on. What Czerny also said was that, gone are the days of unity. Now we're going to have a pluralistic church. To me, that's code for something. And I think it's important for people to understand that. When a progressive, liberal, Catholic prelate, priest, theologian says, we want a more pluralistic church, what they mean is we want a more liberal church. We want a church that allows people to make up their own minds, especially in matters of human sexuality. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what they really mean. Because notice something, there was no pluralism with the question of immigration, climate change, or any of the hard dogmatic interests of the left that Pope Francis championed. There's no wiggle room there. There's no pluralism there. Or in the COVID vaccines that the Pope mandated for all Vatican employees. Where was the pluralism there? Where was the freedom of conscience? No. What they mean is we want a sexually liberal church. That's what they mean.
Right. And I think that's just an important thing to understand, that there's the text and there's the subtext. And I think that one of the things that's been positively frustrating for both of us, I think in our different ways, but ultimately landing in the same spot, is that there's this strange disconnect with sort of the privileging of sound good, feel good soundbite theology, which is a cover story, I think, for something much more authoritarian and much more, there's a way, for instance, in which the word dialogue is used, and this is old stuff, but I do think it's worth reinvoking here. You use the phrase or the idea of dialogue as a cover up, because who doesn't like a good dialogue? Like, look at us, we're dialoguing right now, we're friends, Larry. But when dialogue is used as a cover story for something much more sinister, I think that's where the frustration stems from.
Yeah, because when this is another code word. The language is very Orwellian. It has a double meaning beyond the surface meaning. It almost contradicts the surface meaning. And that's what I mean by Orwellian. The fact is, when they say dialogue, they mean there are these settled moral doctrines of the church that we want to make not settled. So let's talk about these issues to death. Let's keep bringing them up in conversation until we get the changes that we want. And at that point, all dialogue will cease. And we saw this in the 70s.
Right.
I'm an old fart. Okay. Yeah. I lived through the silly season of the 60s and the 70s. And this is lefty Catholics are totalitarians. They are, or at least little dictators when they get into chancery positions of power. They don't want dialogue. They don't want pluralism. They want their way. And once they're in a position of power, they impose their way. Look at Traditionis Custodes. Where is the pluralism and dialogue there?
Right.
No.
Yeah. No.
The traditionalists are just to be slapped down and put into their place, shut up and go away.
Cherney, if I were a good streamer, if I were a good podcaster, I would have had this clip ready. But he said, Cherney, and he's a cardinal, I believe, from Canada, named by Francis, I believe, during the Amazonian Synod. But I wish I would have. The last part that he said is in this little clip that I saw was, look, we've worked so hard to get rid of unity. Okay, so. Yeah. Interesting reveal, I think, there. And I think that's true. I think that has very much been what he's wanted to do. But that goes back to my question about the Pope. Like, what is the Pope and what is the Pope for and all of that? Unity, as you say, clarity, as you say. But, I was very surprised. I've been really thinking a lot about generational stuff. And you're about a decade older than me, so... I'm like right smack dab in the middle of Gen X. You're sort of at the tail end of the boomers, right? And
I'm at the end. I was born in 1958, one of the last years.
One of the last years of so you're officially in that cohort. And I'm fascinated by the way in which the world looks when you're between 15 and 20 is sort of the way that you can kind of project forward, into things. And I was surprised, Larry, to learn that the idea of the papacy was much more what you and I would consider a kind of branch manager, kind of sort of overseeing kind of, whereas, for me, the papacy that I grew up with, of course, was John Paul II. And as we have talked about before, an absolute rock star, an absolute living sort of symbol of virility and hope and all those kinds of things, a true sort of international hero. But if you look at the way in which the papacy sort of had been embodied in prior generations and certainly prior centuries, it was a much more sort of humble branch manager sort of idea. How has that changed for you? And so the way that you conceive of the papacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like the thing about saying where you say, your direction in life is pretty much set by those years, 15 to 20, in some ways. You also, there's a deepening and there's a growth. Like when I was 15 to 20, I was an uber conservative Catholic. Right. Who thought that, the church was made up of good guys and bad guys, and the good guys were the conservatives, the bad guys were the liberals. You get the kind of picture. Now that's, I'm still a conservative theologian, to use those hackneyed terms, but obviously over time, intellectually, I've matured and that conservatism has deepened and so on. But long story short, I was a big supporter of the idea that one never criticizes the Pope, whether it was Paul VI or John Paul II or Pope Benedict. No, you don't. Rome is what holds this thing together. And these popes are just humble servants of the truth. Yeah. They're not trying to, like I said, generate new ideas, and they're just humble servants of the truth. Uh, so in many ways, I think it's true of a lot of people who thought that way. That and I was obviously intellectually aware that a pope can make a mistake. A pope can do
Yeah,
some
yeah,
dumb things. I was aware of that, but in my soul, it was the problem in the church today is dissent from basic doctrines. Rome is holding the center. Do not
yep,
dissent from Rome. But with
yep,
Pope Francis,
right, right.
that's gone out the window. Uh,
And I think
and
that's an underrated dynamic. I mean, because like for folks like you and to me as well, you were a little bit deeper into it. You were in the the sort of the theological circles. I mean, that has always been the world for you professionally. That if you grew up, if you cut your teeth like you did during the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, your common role was to defend. Pretty, actively and aggressively. Your role was really sort of to defend the papacy and the
yeah,
church in general from the kind of the pretty regular smears that would come out of the mainstream media and all those sorts of things, as well as those churchmen that were within the guild who were very much against that damn poll, right? I mean, that was very
yeah.
much a real thing. And then this all gets sort of flipped. I know for myself, this is sort of tempered and altered my conception of what a pope is and what a pope can be and can't be. How much has it sort of altered for you?
Well, in one sense, it hasn't altered at all because, like I said,
Okay.
intellectually, I was always aware that popes can make a mistake. But when I was growing up, a lot of people who are younger don't understand that the big issue that scuttled the papacy of Pope Paul VI wasn't the liturgy, it was
Right.
contraception, it was
Right.
Humanae
Right.
Vitae.
Right.
People need to understand the massive criticism that came towards Paul VI because of Humanae Vitae, the massive theological dissent from within the church, the mass exodus of priests and nuns from religious life for a variety of reasons. The liturgy was not the neuralgic point, not the neuralgic
Right.
issue.
Right. And I would just add here, and I think this is an important point to remember. The liturgy has become a kind of condensed symbol. But at the
Yes.
time, people were very excited for these changes. Now, look, that might offend my liturgical sensibilities. If you're asking Cale Zeldin in the year 2025 what kind of liturgy he would prefer, I'm way more of a TLM guy than I am an NO guy, right? But at the time, and everybody's going to have to like wrap their head around this. It was not a controversial move, except for a couple of like famous old school people who sort of complained about those changes. The changes came; they were largely anticipated. They were largely thrilled to sort of go into the vernacular. And when they made the change, remember they translated the Latin Mass into the vernacular first, and then they roll out a few years later the new mass. Those changes were largely kind of generally accepted as well and good. Now, look, this might upset you people who are in the live chat right now who are going to listen to this, especially my young trad friends. But this is just true. That was and I think this is a really important point. Paul VI, that was not the controversy. Humanae Vitae and including Humanae Vitae, the sort of the liberalizing impulses of the Concilium school and the Bologna school, they were really upset at Paul VI, and then certainly at that damn poll for slowing down what they saw as an historical inevitability.
Yes. And so this brings me, it's all true of the liturgy, by the way. I didn't, for example, as a young man, begin to become questioning and dissatisfied with the Novus Ordo until I was kind of told I was supposed to not like it by people that I admired. Sort of mimetic desire.
Right, right.
Girardian idea. I didn't have the idea in my head to desire the old mass until other people started desiring the old mass. But they did start causing me to think, you know what, there are some deficiencies in the Novus Ordo. Now, personally, I'm high liturgy. I go to an ordinary liturgy.
Yeah.
I do prefer mass in the vernacular, but that's neither here nor there. The point is this that I want to make, and by emphasizing the dissent from Humanae Vitae.
Yeah.
The biggest, and how my own attitudes in some sense have not changed, it's that Pope has changed, And thus my reaction to that is different, because to me, in my entire life, both as a young man and then as a then a seminary and then a theologian,
Right.
the key point that that the liberal critics of the papacy always centered in on was moral theology.
Right.
The dissent against Paul VI was in the area of moral theology. The dissent against John Paul II was in his moral theology, Veritatis Splendor, Evangelium Vitae, a little bit with regard to the ordination of women.
Right.
But notice how that has never become this massive issue in the same way that, and you know, on through Benedict.
Right.
This
Right.
is my problem with Pope Francis. Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict spent a great deal of energy and much time in their papacies on unifying the church around her traditional moral teachings.
Mhm.
One of the reasons why John Paul II developed the theology of the body was precisely to flesh out the full sexual theology of the church in a deeper and more profound reflection. That was important because there were a million dissenting voices on more in the area of moral theology, and it morphed from being concerned with contraception to LGBTQ to people who simply, you know, cohabitate.
Right.
You see this all in the German Synodal Vague.
Yep.
So now along comes Pope Francis and says, never mind any of that. That's all judgmentalness.
Right.
That's all indiatrism. That's all backwardism. That's all pharisaicalism. We need a moral theology that is more attuned to the messiness of the complex circumstances of people's lives. There's a word for that. It's called proportionalism. All right. The great
lay it out for us.
I studied under the late great moral theologian Germain Grisey when I was at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg. And Grisey's entire it's called the New Natural Law Theory. A lot of Thomists have issues with it, maybe a little too Kantian, but nevertheless, his main target were the proportionalists. Proportionalism is essentially Catholic situation ethics, that the morality of an act depends upon motives and your complex circumstances. In fact, to place any emphasis at all upon the objective act that one is engaging in, especially in matters sexual, theologians like Charlie Kern and so forth accuse the Pope of physicalism, biologism.
Right.
You're reducing a moral act to its biological aspects. Right. Well, it's a biological action, for crying out loud. It's a bodily action.
Right.
And
we're incarnate beings. We're incarnate beings, Larry.
Has moral significance is to enter into a kind of Gnostic understanding of the unimportance of the body. This is what John Paul fought against. Then along comes Francis and says, he praised, Pope Francis early in his papacy, praised the moral theology of Bernard Herring as a model for doing theology, of moral theology. Bernard Herring was one of the first proportionalists, massive dissenter from Humanae Vitae, profound critic of Veritatis Splendor and the papacy of John Paul. And there's Francis praising this guy. Then he guts the John Paul II Institute in Rome. He guts the Pontifical Academy for Life, all which had professors that were teaching in line with John Paul and Benedict's moral theology. And he replaces all of them with proportionalist type thinkers. They don't call it that anymore. They call it pastoral gradualness. They call it a new paradigm. There's nothing new about it. It's simply old ideas repackaged.
All right. So what I want to talk then about here is, so we've seen this sort of this enervation of the faithful. You tack toward being popular. Look, nobody loved Pope Francis more than the New York Times, right? Nobody loved the Pope Francis more than mainstream media outlets, which is, again, if you were 25, you have no idea what it was like in the prior papacies. I mean, a pope was, public enemy number one for the better part of 35, 45 years. And then all of a sudden, who am I to judge, sort of triggers this chain reaction in which, all of a sudden, the mainstream media loves the Catholic, this new Catholic Church, right? Okay. So I believe personally, based upon my conversations with people, the fact that I teach young people, that this has had an incredible effect upon people's faith in the Catholic Church as a kind of bedrock type thing. Whether you like that bedrock or not, it was certainly understood to be this sort of whatever, some kind of edifice. All right. How do you assess the damage of the last 12 years? Because, and then really, maybe not so much how you and I might assess that damage, but how do you think the cardinal electors have assessed, who are about, in a few short days here, are going to enter into the conclave? How do you think they have assessed the last 12 years?
Okay, these are all great questions. I think for the most part, the damage that's been done over the past 12 years is the demoralization of the church's base.
Right.
The most faithful Catholics, the most devout Catholics were the ones most heavily criticized by Pope Francis in his rhetoric, and actually targeted in things like Traditionis Custodes.
Right.
And thus, part of the damage isn't just the alienation of those Catholics. It is the red pilling of those Catholics away from the true nature of the Second Vatican Council and the kind of communio theology espoused by JP2 and Benedict and the Council, and red pilled them against all of that. Their attitude then became, look, all of that communio theology, Vatican II, JP2, Benedict, none of it could stop the rise of a Francis. We therefore need to simply scrape the barnacles of Vatican II and the post-Vatican II church off the ship of the church and roll the clock back into some kind of traditionalist Pius, but then you find trads that even oppose Pius XII because
but we can keep playing that game. But to your point, Larry, is that my sense amongst my trad friends is that there has not been an honest reckoning with what has happened in our lifetimes. And therefore, there's a sort of like, you know what? I'm just done. I'm done playing this stupid game. We were feckless in the face of a pope who could just sort of, throw it all in a blender. So like, why should I care? Now, look, you and I can have, I think we do have esteem and nuanced takes on this sort of thing. But can you understand, again, my question is, how do we assess the damage? Can we at least understand why a 25-year-old trad, right, who has grown up, remember, they were 12 or so when Francis was elevated to the papacy. Can we understand why they might be prone to that kind of just wipe this damn slate clean?
Yeah, I can understand it. And, off camera before we came on, you said, that a lot of trads feel betrayed by the more conservative JP2 wing of the church. And I can understand that sense of betrayal. I really can. Because in point of fact, neither JP2 nor Benedict fully eliminated from the church these dissenting voices. They simply went underground. And anybody that was involved in the academic guild, as I was in university teaching, knew you'd go to theology conferences with other professors. 90% of them were still old-fashioned liberals. And you knew that all they needed to come out of the woodwork like roaches was a pope that would re-empower them. And that's what happened. And so the formerly conservative JP2 Catholics, many of them felt betrayed. Like, oh, geez. So I can understand it. On the other hand, I am also going to be critical of what I consider to be their overreaction. The fact is this, the argument that they present, which is, you will know a tree by its fruits, and everything after the council came apart, and therefore we're going to reject the council. That's a two-edged sword argument. Yeah. Because previous to the council, what reigned supreme was the neo-scholastic theological paradigm. And looky, the neo-scholastic theological paradigm is precisely the paradigm that trained all of the bishops at Vatican II, right? One could say not even neo-scholasticism prevented this betrayal of the church. And I think that peeling back the layers of that onion, and you have to step back and say, no, the causes of the crisis in the church are multifocal. And a lot of it has nothing to do with theology or bad theology. It simply has to do with this cultural hurricane that happened in the 60s. There is a control in this experiment. It's called Protestantism.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It too, or even Orthodox Judaism. Every religion in Western culture suffered massive declines due to the Cultural Revolution of the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Right. And you can't emphasize that enough, because, it's very tempting to just say, well, if they had just done nothing, we would be fine, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
really? Like, I mean, okay, not
Hey, look,
really.
Joseph Ratzinger already in 1958, when he
Right.
was a young priest, penned this famous article in this journal in Germany called Hochschild. And the title of the article was "The New Heathenism or the New Paganism in the Church." And it was scathing. It was a denunciation of the average Catholic of his time as a Catholic in name only,
Right.
a
And
Chino.
remember the significance of that date, 1958. Remember, the council isn't announced until, I believe, 60 or 61.
Yeah.
So this is an anticipation. And of course, you're also talking about a Ratzinger then, who was much more sort of, for lack of a better way to say it, much more progressive in his sort of inclinations at that point. So he's making this kind of assessment. So look, somebody in the comments makes a good point. Andrea makes a good point. Like, the TLM really is not this internationally nascent popular thing. It really is a kind of niche thing in America and certain portions of Europe. So I don't want to get sort of too fixated on TLM issues or liturgical issues. I happen to think that those things could be potentially important, but I really want to direct this conversation, Larry, to this sense of, okay, so we've talked about Francis. So why are we still talking about Francis? Well, in order to make an informed, Holy Spirit, hopefully inspired decision on who to elevate to succeed Francis, I think you have to have a kind of sober assessment, not only of the last 12 years, but really, we're still talking about the council, right? So I just wonder, what do you think a cardinal elector is thinking as they prepare themselves to enter the enclosure?
Well, I think there are many cardinal electors. And by the way, I'll preface this by saying I don't have any particular inside knowledge, even though I'm in Rome, although I have had meetings with journalists, Catholic journalists, Americans who are here in Rome, who do have more inside knowledge. Okay. And then I sit and learn at their feet. And that's why I came over here, was so that I could network with those people who do have access to the corridors of power. They meet with cardinals clandestinely in off Broadway cafeterias. They do, and the vibe, to use your word, that I'm getting is that there are many cardinal electors who are concerned with the church's direction under the past 12 years and do seek a correction. They are seeking a pope that it's not going to be a Cardinal Burke or a Cardinal Mueller or a Cardinal Sarah. It's not going to be a staunchly conservative kind of pope who's going to come in like a wrecking ball and say, off with their heads. Not that those guys would do that, but you know what I mean. That's not the vibe. What they're looking for, apparently, many cardinal electors, is a sort of centrist, moderate candidate, neither right nor left, who has skills at communicating, and is very adept at creating consensus. And so that means you're looking at potential popes. The guys that they're looking at are just going to be guys who are slightly left of center or slightly right of center, but they want a centrist guy. So that means a right of center cardinal, like a Cardinal Erdo from Hungary. That should make Rod Dreher happy. All right, a Cardinal Erdo from Hungary, and don't count him out, a somewhat left of center candidate in Cardinal Zuppi, who I've met a few times when he was still just a priest.
He's a friend. He's a fan of Rod's, so that's funny.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, and I'll take a little sidestep here and talk about Zuppi. Even though he's left of center, and I'm sure I'm going to have theological disagreements with him here and there.
Yeah.
When I spent a semester in Rome with my students from De Sales, and he was pastor at Santa Maria in Trastevere.
Oh, was he really? Oh,
Yes. He was pastor there, and he was in charge of the community of San Egidio, which
yeah, of course.
wields enormous power in
Yeah.
Roman circles.
Yeah, yeah.
And I went to Mass there. That parish was so alive and so vibrant, so amazing. It is for many people their favorite parish in Rome still to this day.
That was my parish when I was there for 5 months back in early 90s. That was my parish.
So you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Zuppi was not there yet, I don't think.
No. Just those are my stomping grounds. Just everywhere my stomping grounds.
Oh yeah, I love Trastevere. It's my favorite neighborhood in Rome. But anyway, I don't want to make it sound like, Cardinal Zuppi would recognize me on the street, because he wouldn't. My interactions with him were both from a distance, where I would simply watch him interact with parishioners. But I did have a chance to chat with him a little bit informally after Mass on a couple of occasions. Told him who I was. I was a theologian. He was very interested in that. I told him I was a fan of Hansuas von Balthasar. He knew von Balthasar, in his theology, and likes it. But I was, I don't know if he was, in a sense, just sugarcoating things. He knew I like von Balthasar. But the point is this. He came across to me as a man of deep prayer, deep kindness, deep gentleness. He's got a pastor's soul. So I wouldn't, there are people who are discounting his candidacy on the grounds that not even the Society of San Egidio is really supporting his candidacy. They're kind of supporting somebody else. But nevertheless, I, for one, say don't overlook Zuppi, for the simple reason that he is a very attractive person in his personality, and he's kind of a centrist, as is Erdo. Another name that's being thrown around is the Cardinal of Marseille, France, Cardinal Avenile. I don't know how you pronounce his name in French. Avenile. Avenil. I don't know.
My French is terrible. Go ahead.
I have very terrible French as well. I only knew enough French to read it to pass my doctoral dissertation language exams. German.
Better than me. Keep going.
So anyway, so that, he's emerging as a potential candidate because he's a centrist. So, Erdo, Zuppi, I'll just call him the Bishop of Marseille, France. Avenile. And I'm trying to think of a few others who would be considered more centrist candidates, while the chief among them, being someone I don't want, is Cardinal Parolin, who's a bigwig in the Vatican, Secretary of State. He's basically running the show right now.
Right.
And there's a lot of scuttlebutt talk here in Rome that if it's a long conclave and no clear candidate emerges, they might just land on Parolin and say, fine, he's a known commodity.
So that's interesting. So I had kind of the opposite take on Parolin. I don't like him, just to be clear. But I thought that if a couple of things about the conclave, right? Some of the earlier talk prior to Francis's death, a lot of the talk was, Francis has stacked the deck. The entire College of Cardinals is basically appointed by him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a red herring. I think that's almost always true. We have to recall that every cardinal that elected Pope Francis was appointed by either John Paul II or Benedict XVI. So I think that that's a silly frame, filter, whatever to see through. But I do think the significant thing that Francis has done is that in making the conclave, the College of Cardinals, decidedly non-Roman centric, will in a weird sort of way open up the possibility that this, is not going to be a kind of rubber stamp papacy. So therefore, my thinking, you could hear me out, Larry, is that if it was a fast conclave, that would favor a Parolin, because he's an inside operator. He knows anyway, he knows where all the bodies are buried, those kinds of things. So if he could sort of fast track, that would happen. But if it goes past day 1, day 2, and into the beyond, then that gives the cardinals who don't know each other, right? Traditionally, they would have had all of these moments to get to know each other over the years. They do not know one another. So I thought that the longer they have to get to know one another, they might do something interesting.
Well, the thinking could be, and those who say Parolin has a chance if it's a long conclave, is that he's clearly going to be a strong candidate up front. But if his candidacy falters and other voices emerge and he doesn't get the majority of votes and the conclave drags on, if the conclave becomes sort of hopelessly deadlocked, with people not willing to make compromises, he could then re-emerge.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
You know what?
Yeah.
Maybe we too hastily dismissed the candidacy of Cardinal Parolin, because it's very, very clear we need somebody at the helm that isn't going to stir the pot too much in one direction or the other. Now, I don't think it's going to be Parolin. And what's the old Italian, the Roman adage? He who goes into the conclave, a pope, comes out a cardinal. And that means, none of the usual people that you look to and say, oh, I think that we can only take that adage so far. It was very, very clear in the conclave that elected Paul VI that Paul VI was the preferred candidate, and he got elected. John Paul came out of nowhere, but Pope Benedict was the guy everybody expected was going to succeed John Paul, and he did. Bergoglio came out of nowhere. All right. And so, it's an open question. At this point, there's usually, like, what my point is, with a Paul VI or a Benedict, it's very clear to everyone concerned, this is our guy.
Right.
And so it's a short conclave, 2 days, you're done, you're out. But the vibe I'm getting is that there is right now confusion.
Okay. Interesting. So we've talked a lot over the years, the two of us, about theological confusion. What do you mean when you just invoked the word, but I sense you might mean it in a slightly different way. What are you talking about?
Well, when I say there's confusion, the problem is there is no Wojtyła in the wings. There is no Ratzinger in the wings. There is not even a Montini in the wings. The sad reality is that there is not a superstar cardinal. There just isn't. And everybody has their strengths and weaknesses amongst the various cardinals, but not one of them stands out as, by golly, there's our guy.
Right.
And therefore, and plus, once again, a negative on the papacy of Pope Francis. He did not call the cardinals together very often, and so they don't know each other.
Right.
And so that is it. But so your point that the longer the conclave goes, the more they get to know each other, the more then a candidate might emerge out of that mix is probably what's going to happen, because they're confused right now. There's about 10 different names that are being tossed around, not one of which is the obvious choice. Right. There's obviously, despite denials to the contrary, politicking going on behind the scenes. I think today was the 7th meeting of the cardinals in the interregnum period. So they're already getting to know each other. And there are obviously going to be clandestine dinners at off-Broadway restaurantes where people are, honing their message and what's going to happen. And so what we might see is somebody just come out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. Somebody you just wouldn't like a Cardinal Rajith. I believe he's from Sri Lanka, maybe India, but I think Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. He is known to be a liturgical conservative and a theological centrist. So, and he's got some strong credentials that people have pointed to. One guy that I don't think is a serious candidate for the papacy that a lot of secular outlets in particular mention is Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines.
Right.
I'm not going to say why I think that, but because it would betray confidential sources. But
I'll say something because I don't have anything to betray. Right. My sense is that he was very much a kind of favorite amongst sort of the Francis crew as a kind of potential Francis Francis too. But I think that the fact that he was sort of sent away and under mysterious, he was in charge of world evangelization, I'm pretty sure, put in place by Francis, and then kind of sent away. So whatever happened behind the scenes, there seems to be some real reason why Francis de-emphasized him, demoted him, because he was, he's very likable. He's kind of this sort of happy. I mean, honestly, he's not for me. I see this guy and he just seems like such a kind of a flitty nitwit of a nothing.
Well, you've seen the video that's making the rounds.
Oh God, yeah.
Of him singing John Lennon's song Imagine.
And I've seen a lot of other videos, and it's just so unserious. But fine.
He's also too young.
Okay.
Age is a factor in this. A lot of people have tossed out the name of Cardinal Pizzaballa, a Latin patriarch of Jerusalem.
Right.
But Pizzaballa just turned 60.
Yeah.
So that if he lives as long as Pope Francis lived, we're looking at potentially a 28-year papacy. Right. And what if he lives even longer? And so some cardinals might look at that and say, that's attractive, actually.
Yeah.
Let's have another John Paul II long papacy to sort of end many of our controversies. But I think most cardinals are looking at that and going, no, we need the Wojtyła was an outlier exception because he was just so perfect for the job. But generally speaking, in the history of the church, you don't elect as Pope somebody who's 60 years old. I believe that and Tagle is still pretty young. I think it's going to be somebody in their 70s.
Right. Right.
Young enough to reign for maybe 10, 12, 13 years like Francis did, but not so young that they could reign for 25 or 30 years. So
I want to ask a sort of a final group of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the chat. Folks in the chat, two things: hit the like and subscribe button. Larry's website is gaudium@spes22.com. You should go check out his stuff. You should subscribe to his newsletter. You all know mine. It's kalezeldin@substack.com. Please do us a favor and subscribe to our Substacks where we put our things out. And then of course hit the YouTube buttons. Okay, now Larry.
One correction: mine is not a Substack.
Right. Fair. Sorry. Mine is right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Larry, you're also working for The Pillar. This is a free advertisement for JD and Ed's outfit called The Pillar. If you're at all interested in church matters, whether you're Catholic or not, nobody does it better in from the American context than JD and Ed Condon. Go to The Pillar, post and subscribe, because it's really great. It's a Substack that I actually pay for. So they're the real deal, and Larry does some work for them on the editorial front, which is fantastic. Okay. Is that fair? Did I say that right?
Well, I'm an op-ed columnist for them.
That's what I meant. Sorry. Yeah, not editorial. Op-ed. I meant that. Okay. Okay. So my sense, and this is true, I think, of my friends on the leftish side of things and my friends on the rightish side of things, even though that's not perfect, fine, whatever. Roughly traditionalist in orientation, roughly progressive in orientation, right? My sense is that the one thing that people don't really pay attention to, and I don't know why, is that the papacy exists in history, in time, in a context. And I know a theologian starts to get nervous when you talk about that, especially if you're kind of on the sort of more traditional side theologically. But why is it important, or do you think it's important to understand that the papacy exists in an historical context and that individual popes emerge and are selected for a specific context?
Well, I think that's very true. And if you believe in the Holy Spirit's guidance of the church, as I know you do, as do I, then you have to believe that just like with saints, so too with popes, that the Holy Spirit guides the cardinals to choose a pope that is most conducive to the signs of the times, most conducive to the needs of the church of today. Now, that being said, I want to hasten to add, I think this is important. Popes are not chosen by the Holy Spirit.
Right.
You know, Pope Benedict made this clear. As Pope Benedict said, there have been too many awful popes in the history of the church, too many terrible popes in the history of the church, to view God as, in some sense, directly intervening to inspire almost infallibly the cardinal electors to elect the right guy. Unless you want to take the point of view that God sends us bad popes every once in a while as a form of judgment, as a form of punishment for the church's sins.
Yeah.
But more likely, it is that the Holy Spirit guides the cardinals. Absolutely. The Holy Spirit guides, but the cardinals are free to ignore that guidance.
Right.
Because they're human and they're sinners, and their judgment can be clouded by their sins. And just like all of us.
Right.
Okay? I mean, it's true of all of us, right? We all seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit. What is the will of God in my life? And yet it's very possible for all of us to ignore that guidance because of our sins. So in other words, we could get a lousy pope.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But, so one of the things that I've been making great pains to point out to folks on X and elsewhere and in real life, is that it's very easy to look at, say, the papacy of John Paul II or Paul VI, or Francis, and ignore the sort of the surrounding kind of context of which exerts pressures on them, both pressures on the cardinal, both pressures on their actual papacy, but also I think, the pressures that the cardinal electors feel as they walk into that conclave. So what I'm really kind of getting is, like, how much do you feel like this sort of the ambient cultural and historical pressures make upon a cardinal elector as they walk into the Sistine Chapel?
Now I see what you're asking. I'm sorry, I misunderstood before. But I think the cultural influences are enormous. And I've often said that there really are only two kinds of bishops in the church today. Bishops who get the cultural and ecclesial crisis that we are in, and bishops who don't get it. Bishops who just think, well, what's wrong with modern culture? What's wrong with the church conforming itself to the modern world? Isn't that a good thing? Versus versus bishops that look out with a proper analysis of the signs of the times and they can embrace the spoils of Egypt. They can take what's good in the modern world, Christianize them, and make them our own, but then, in a sense, burning away the dross of error that often encapsulates the ideas of the modern world. And here's the key. The nature of the crisis we face is that all of the greatest values of the modern world are, in a sense, attenuated, denuded Christian values. Christian values that have been hollowed out, have their theological core hollowed out and replaced with a little secular DNA. And the cellular membrane remains sort of this Christian value. I mean, think of the dignity of every individual person, our rights, our, the need to be endlessly compassionate and forgiving and the right. These are all Christian ideas. Now, the problem is this. Those ideas have all been, like I said, I'm going to try to avoid this word, bastardized.
Okay.
And so what we need are cardinals to go into that conclave who understand this cultural dynamic we face, that the church is in some sense being seduced into the embracing of these values because they sound so Christian. Words like inclusion, words like dialogue. These are all code words for certain secular values, but they have a certain Christian sounding tonality. And the stupider cardinals, and I'm just going to call them that, the dumb cardinals, that sounds good, inclusion.
Right.
Isn't Christ about including people?
Right.
Please. All right. The other cardinals get, so the question is going to be in the conclave, how many cardinals get that cultural dynamic versus how many cardinals do not?
Right.
And that's the free radical we simply don't know.
That's good. Right. Because, part of me, as a layman, who's not a professional Catholic or a professional theologian, I'm not even a theologian, right? I just watch things and I read things. I make my observations, as everyone knows. But part of it's like, how can you not know those things, Larry? Like,
I know.
How can you not know those things? And so now part of that is a sort of rhetorical question on my part, and I'm being a little bit of a jerk. But I'm actually asking you, for the sake of my audience, how can you, as a cardinal elector, not understand those things?
Because you're an atheist. Because you don't really believe. And I know that's a radical thing to say, but from the day I first started my blog 5 years ago, it's, as the British say, it's what I'm on about, eh?
That's right.
Our culture is characterized by a profound sense of what I call the nullification of the question of God. It's our culture is not characterized by an overt atheism. It's characterized by a de facto practical atheism.
Yeah, it's cryptic. It's cryptic. Yeah.
Wherein God isn't overtly denied; He's simply ignored and sublated, if He's affirmed at all, into various secular processes. and therefore, the very question of God gets dismissed as irrelevant to our social constructions. And insofar as there are many, and this was Ratzinger's point in 1958, insofar as cardinals, average lay people, and so forth have drank the Kool-Aid of modern secularity with its faux Christian values, insofar as they've done that, they have imbibed this de facto atheism. They have imbibed this nullification of God and have replaced traditional Catholic vision of things, eschatology, soteriology, with a new set of concepts and ideas that have been repackaged to sound Christian, but innately are in effect a denial of the efficacy of grace, a denial of the realities of salvation. And that's why you see so many of them reducing the church to simply a philanthropic NGO. The church is only good insofar as it helps the immigrants and feeds the poor. The rest of all of that doctrinal gobbledygook, who cares? And you saw an element of this even in Pope Francis, who was constantly denigrating theology, denigrating doctrine as abstractions. We have to deal with real people. And when you start saying stuff like that, what you're really saying is real people are secular people, who don't have any need whatsoever for the truths of God that we see in Revelation. And so I think it's a crisis of unbelief.
Yeah. I would only add to that, one of my professors back in the day, he himself was an Italian, a son of an Italian immigrant family. And he said, Cale, I grew up, I'm a practicing Catholic, but I sort of had to become a practicing Catholic because I grew up in a very anti-clerical home. Right? A lot of people don't understand that about Italian immigrants, that there's a huge strain of anti-clericalism in Italian immigrants. And part of it was a class issue, right? That the clerics were fat. And he said, Cale, there's always a temptation amongst the clerics, that you are a priest because of the 3 hots and a cot rule. That is, you have 3 hot meals and a bed to sleep in. And he then went on to say some version of that. Don't underestimate that, some people want more than just 3 hots and a cot. You want 3 really nice hots and a really nice cot.
I was just about to add that. I mean, when we see the cocaine-fueled orgies that took place in the Vatican not so long ago, that were actually exposed and shown to be true.
All right. So Larry, let's go. So I'm going to scan the comments for the 3. I told people, all right. Luigi just says what? All right, Luigi. All right. And I will put them on the screen for you, Larry, so you can jump in. All right. Andrew says, and I'll read it out. Who are reliable sources of information related to the Conclave Vatican? Obviously, the mainstream media is out. So who should I follow on Twitter during this thing? This is Andrew. Andrew teaches English in Korea. And so it's like 10 o'clock at night for him. Good to hear from you, Andrew.
Well,
what do you think, Larry?
That's a great question. And if you're looking for what can I find on Twitter, I would say look to the Pillar, J.D. Flynn and Ed Condon have put. And what I like about the pillar is it leans conservative, obviously, but not. It doesn't lead in a radical sort of right wing direction. It's
They
very,
really don't.
very.
Yeah, they really don't. They're very
They're
balanced.
good journalists, and they're very measured in their criticism, which oftentimes causes more traditionalist type people to criticize them as being too clever by half. Let's just say what we mean, and so on.
Right. And I would just add to that, Larry, Ed and JD both are canon lawyers. And
Yes.
so they really have a deep understanding about the way that, like, just like the way the church works and operates, that kind of, procedural issues, law issues. So they're very balanced and very measured.
Yeah, and much of their stuff is behind a paywall, but much of it is free. But if you want a source that is totally free, and I write for this as well. In fact, I'm writing an article for them. It's Catholic World Report. There are tons of great articles in Catholic World Report, completely free, by various authors that all lean conservative, if you want to use those terms. Carl Olson is a fantastic, wonderful editor who essentially allows his writers to speak their mind. And let me tell you, that's critical, because you're getting the unvarnished opinion of those people who are doing the analyzing. I've written for some publications where that's not true, where you submit an article and they say, oh, that's too incendiary, or this is too that, and you need to eliminate that, and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden your piece is toothless and doesn't really reflect your voice. It might have some true things in it, but it's not your voice. Catholic World Report has articles by people whose true voice comes out.
That's great. Okay. Next question. This is from a friend of mine, Luke Thompson. Isn't what we're looking for faithful innovation in a Pope leader, Christ figure? Question mark, question mark, question mark.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I think that's spot on true. It's a great comment.
Yeah.
We don't want people that are simply going to be what we used to call Denzinger theologians, where you just,
Explain that to the crowd.
Denzinger is a book. It's a collection of all the church's dogmas and doctrines and so forth. It's an indispensable reference text for a theologian. Correct. What does the church teach on hell? What does it teach on purgatory? And then you go to Denzinger. Okay, here are and the good thing about Denzinger is that it lists the levels of authority that each of these teach. This is infallible. This is pretty low. Might not be true. So we don't need a pope that simply has memorized Denzinger and is simply going to repeat doctrines in a kind of boring way. Not that there's anything wrong with repeating doctrine. You get my point. You want a pope who is, on the other hand, the other extreme is we don't want a pope who is nothing but a generator of new creative ideas. Look at me. I'm the Pope, and here's what I say now. Like I said, the oracle on the Tiber. No, you need the coming together of creativity and fidelity to the doctrines of the church, which was, after all, the vision of Pope John the 23rd of the Second Vatican Council. Right. Let's take the truths of the faith and let's translate them into a language that modern people can understand. Now, maybe that project was naive, but I think we do need something along those lines.
Yeah, but the impulse, to your point, the impulse is absolutely true and real. I mean, pretending anyway, I'll skip that. All right, on to McMo. What would a pope who was more conservative than Francis, but just as good at playing the Pope? What do you make of that? In other words, if I'm understanding him correctly, there is a sort of dramatic role, right? You would imagine that sort of on the world stage that a pope plays. In other words, what if he is theologically more conservative? I'm guessing here, McMo. What if he's theologically more conservative, but still understands the role of being kind of a winsome public witness?
Well, yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with that more. Mm-hmm. I mean, John Paul II, despite some of the mistakes he made, continues to be my ecclesiastical hero. I think one of the greatest popes in the history of the church, because I think precisely that's what he combined. Mm-hmm. He combined a deep theological orthodoxy with this powerful charismatic persona that played beautifully into the media environment of our age. And he was also an astute observer of culture. And to me, those are the three things we need in a pope: doctrinal orthodoxy, a certain charismatic, media savvy persona, Yeah, and then also though very savvy with regard to the politics of the world and the politics of the Vatican. I
Right.
think Pope Benedict had the theological orthodoxy part right. To
Yeah.
a certain extent, he had a certain media charisma simply because he was so genteel and avuncular.
Mhm.
But I don't think he was very savvy at
Right.
internal church politics at all.
Right.
And I think it's one of
Right.
the reasons he resigned. But so those, I think that, yeah, that's what we need, an Orthodox Pope who knows how to pope.
Right. Yeah. I like that. I mean, someone who knows how to pope. I think it's an underrated sort of soft skill. It's sort of hard to exactly put your finger on it, but I think that's exactly
You
what
know,
you're talking
I
about.
want to add one thing too,
Yeah.
along the lines of, a pope who knows how to pope. Uh, I was talking to a Protestant friend of mine. Says, obviously, I'm not a Catholic, but I'm very excited to hear you're going to Rome. What a once in a lifetime opportunity! How great it's going to be for you to be there when the conclave is happening. And she said to me, she said, "I'll tell you what, you Catholics, you've got the symbols down, right?
Right.
I
Right.
mean, is there anything more dramatic than the white smoke coming out of the Sistine Chapel and
Right.
all that sort of stuff? I love it. I think the dramatics of it are wonderful. So not only a pope who knows how to pope, but a church who knows how to church, and to not forget that we are a church of bells, smells, sacraments, and things, and to not
Yeah.
gnostically run away from these great visible physical traditions of the church.
All right. Okay. So I have to skip over a couple, but one caught my eye, and I know that this is going to give you some red meat because I know it gives me some red meat. But to me, this is the part that still does not get the kind of attention by the official churchman that it gets. And this is the question. Which cardinal is most likely, if elected, to finally deal with all the sex abuse issues, Rupnik, etc.? And of course, we're using Rupnik here as a kind of condensed symbol for an entire priestly caste, and I'm meaning at the level of bishop, archbishop, and cardinal. Those, not those poor folks that we all know and love at the parish level. We're talking like how Rupnik is the scandal that diagnoses the sickness of a whole system, does it not?
This is a great question. Excuse me. Um, oh man, the cold's
God
kicking in.
bless you.
Anyway,
God bless you.
sorry, please forgive me. But this is the great cancer on the modern church. I mentioned earlier the mistakes made by John Paul II. Forget Assisi and all that, which is exaggerated. The greatest mistake made by John Paul II was ignoring the sex abuse crisis. And I think it's not because Pope John Paul didn't care about the sex abuse crisis. It just was not on his radar for whatever reason. Some of it had to do with the fact that in Eastern Europe under Soviet rule, accusations of priestly sexual infidelity was precisely how the KGB undermined the authority of various priests and bishops.
Right.
George Weigel mentions this, others have. I think it's true. Now, anyway, but it is a cancer. John Paul II, Benedict did a little. Francis has been atrocious.
I mean, truly atrocious.
He's the
Sorry.
one that rehabilitated McCarrick,
Right.
for crying out loud.
Right.
He's the one that ignored the accusations against Bishop Zanketta, from South America. He's the one who ignores Rupnik. He's the one that promotes the Cardinal McElroys of the church, even though McElroy has a kind of checkered past in this regard. Not
Correct.
that he is
Not
abusing,
personally, right, but in terms of managing it, right? That's right.
So the question is so good because I think that it's an ignored issue that can no longer be ignored. And somebody asked earlier, what is great sources? If you want to find the best source on all of these scandals, read any column written on this topic by Christopher Altieri.
Right.
Altieri. He writes a lot in Catholic World Report. He writes for other venues as well. But he used to work in the Vatican. He knows the Vatican, and he has been right on this issue from the start. Okay, now, who's going to be the most likely cardinal to come in and clean up this mess? Well, if you ask me, it would be an African. it would be an African, because Africans have no time for this nonsense. It's not, let me couch that a bit.
Yeah,
It's not as if there isn't a problem with promiscuous loose sexual ethics in Africa.
right,
Because
I know.
they're like the rest of us. All right.
Yeah,
It can
yeah.
be a free for all. So I'm not trying to paint the African Catholic Church as this sexually pure church, because it isn't. But since, as is clearly documented, right, 85% of sexual abuse cases were homosexual in nature. The Africans do not stand for any of that homosexualist stuff. They rejected fiducia supplicans. They are very strong in their opposition to the church changing its teaching on homosexuality. And I think an African pope would come down hard on the proliferation of active homosexuals in the priesthood.
Right.
And let's face it, that's what has to be addressed. Not just the sexual abuse. The cause of the sexual abuse is that, and by the way, I'm very clear, homosexuality as such does not lead to child abuse. I want to be very clear about that. I have too many homosexual friends to make that but there's a certain kind of sexually dysfunctional homosexual that is attracted to the priesthood. Take it from one who was in the seminary and knows clerical ranks. There is a double life kind of homosexual, repressed, dysfunctional, that enters into the priesthood. And that double life festers and it creates the crisis. So you have to go to the root of the problem. And I think in Africa, which is you need to screen candidates to the priesthood very carefully. And that's why I was very disappointed to see Pope Francis, loosen the rules. Oh, we can allow homosexuals to come into the priesthood. No, I think you just have to rule that out.
Well, and look, to me, Larry,
how likely is an African to get elected? I don't know. I don't think it's very likely that we're going to have an African pope.
Right. And to me, it's not just an issue of screening. Like, fine, we can talk about that. But to me, it's the policing and the guarding of this kind of thing after the fact, right? I mean, just because you're an ordained person, you're carrying on in a kind of a double life capacity, we need to be just perfectly intolerant of that kind of double life. And I think that so much of that double life-ism is apparent and is always hovering in the background and in the shadows of all of these sort of strange things that go on. So and I think Altieri's point, is that most of the underrated issues that confound the work of the church in the modern world are governance issues. Oddly enough, it's like
that's Altieri's forte.
Yeah,
that's his point. He believes that the chief failure of the Francis papacy is not a failure of doctrine or theology so much as it is a failure of governance, a massive disregard for the rule of law in the church. Francis routinely disregarded his own legislation. What's the name of the document dealing with bishops who cover up sexual abuse or abuse, vos estis or whatever it's called? Vos estis. Yeah. He routinely went against that himself. He routinely just went against canon law. He would depose a bishop without any particular due process or anything. And the sexual abuse crisis is another perfect example of how he just did whatever he wanted to do, regardless of what canon law says. But I want to go back to something else you said. You're absolutely correct. Screening is not the total answer, precisely because what these kinds of sexually dysfunctional people are very good at is the double life. And so they're very good at play acting, at being a normal sort of person, and they can hide it. So any seminary formated will tell you it's a very difficult thing to ascertain. Mm-hmm. So you're right. It is ultimately a question of zero tolerance for this stuff. That once it comes out, you're gone. You're out of here.
Right. Which is why I made such hay about the Monsignor Burrell scandal that Ed and JD from the Pillar were instrumental in exposing. This is the highest ranking official at the USCCB, the United States Council for Catholic Bishops. I think that I have that right. He's the highest ranking non-bishop member of the congregation, carrying on a very active grinder life wherever sort of he would travel. And, so they caught all kinds of hell because they dared expose this. But then this guy, the balls of this guy, then to go and sue Grindr for violation of terms of service, when I'm like, brother, and suing Grindr because he was not allowed to become a bishop as a result of what he became. And like, it's all right there for us all to see. Like, do you know what this looks like? Apparently you don't, because you don't care. Just a shocking, I continue amazed.
Well, I think that in the case of Monsignor Burrell, I think all he's after right now is money.
Of course.
That's the only thing that can explain the chutzpah of going on there and saying, I was set to be a bishop, and this Grindr
which he was, Larry, which he was.
Oh, he was. And we'll get to that in a second. But the fact that he would bring up the fact that my chances of becoming a bishop were scuttled, I think he's well aware that there's going to be public outrage at such a statement.
Interesting.
But he doesn't care, because in a court of law, when you're suing for damages, all right, the court doesn't care whether it's not very decorous of a Monsignor to publicize that he wanted to be a bishop. They don't care. They're going to look at that objectively and say, okay, monetarily, what was that worth? Should he win his case? I think this is all at this point just about money for him, because his reputation is destroyed already, and he's only ruining it more, and he knows that. So it's got to be about, in my opinion, it's got to be about money. But as you say, Cale, the deeper question is, how did this guy have such a meteoric rise in his ecclesiastical career when he had this double life going on? Now, maybe nobody knew about his double life, but I doubt that. I highly doubt it.
Well, and we know just by listening to Ed and JD in the aftermath of all of that, they were threatened by members of the USCCB, because they dared sort of publicize this. So, in other words, Burrell, this is just me talking, Larry, Burrell is a dime a dozen in that cohort. And that's the problem, that the selection pressures for the leadership of this church that we call ours, right, that we are trying really hard to be faithful sons of the church, it's rotten. The selection pressures are absolutely rotten.
Absolutely rotten. And I know from talking with Jade Hendricks, J.D. Flynn, Ed Kahn, and so forth, I mean, they caught a lot of grief.
Oh,
they caught so much grief over that. And what they were accused of was violating privacy. James Martin came out and said, or what are we doing now? Chasing down people's private lives. Is this really what we want to be as a church? Hey, dude, get a clue.
Yeah.
It's 2002 when the sex abuse crisis hit. You guys don't get a mulligan anymore. Okay. You don't get this presumed privacy to lead your double life anymore. The gay subculture that you champion, Father Martin, is precisely the problem in the church right now. Okay. And for lay, this only shows clerics don't get it.
Right.
Okay. For a bunch of lay people to come forward and say, the bishops aren't going to clean this place up, so let's do it for them. Let's take a look at what these guys are doing in their double life. And by the way, if you're going to use Grindr, you should not have a presumption of privacy.
Right.
Anybody that uses the internet is a fool if they think they have a presumption of privacy.
Right. And honestly, one of the most profound sort of, one of the things that stuck with me earlier on, sometime in my 20s, I came across one of Escriva's books. I'm not an Opus Dei member, but I reading one of his books, and one of the things that he always stressed, is that there must be a unity of Christian life, and in other words, however it is you present yourself to the world has to be what you are in, when nobody's looking. And look, that is a high bar. It's a hard thing. You and I both know that as sort of human beings, right? But that is the gold standard. Like, there's no such thing as a Christian in public and not one in private, right? And so the unwillingness for our leadership to take that seriously and to sort of dismiss Grindr as like, it's a struggle. No, it's not, actually, not at that level. When you're doing that, that's not a struggle. In fact, it's a sign of not struggling to be perfectly blunt. And it has not, whether it was Tinder or Grindr, whether you're hooking up with women or you're hooking up with other men. Like to me, it's not the issue of the type of break of celibacy. It's that you are so blithely doing it.
And to go back to our earlier conversation,
Mm-hmm.
any priest that would be using Grindr on a regular basis and living this double life, what is it they believe?
Right.
Do they believe
Right.
anything? Do
Right.
they believe in sin? Even if you think the church needs to have a more liberal attitude towards human sexuality.
Right.
Even most liberal Catholic moral theologians would argue against the moral validity of just cruising for crying out loud.
No, that's right.
In nobody's theological universe is that acceptable, is my point. And Burrell is smart enough to know that. So you can chalk it up to weakness, but at what point does that weakness translate into such egregious behaviors that it calls into question the faith of the person that is involved?
Right, and this is this last point I'll make here, but what always surprises me in conversations in this regard is that it's, oh, that poor guy, he's sort of struggling with this, but he's not just a passive victim in hookup culture, right? The problem with hookup culture is that not only is it devastating to the one sort of making these pursuits, but it's also a denigration of the person that you're using essentially as an extension of some sort of masturbatory, tautology, right? It's like you're hurting other people. You're allowing other people to turn themselves into things rather than fully formed and flourishing human beings made in the image and likeness of God. And look, weakness is weakness. I get all those sorts of things. I have my own weaknesses myself. But the fact that you could just so blithely sort of throw yourself with such verve into that kind of double life that is murderous to you and to those that you were using it just remains scandalous to me. And I'm no like wilting flower over here. Like I'm not a naive person.
No, I agree. It's deeply scandalous, and shockingly so. And I think also there's another issue that we dare not ignore that fuels the double life, and it's pornography. Forget using Grindr and actually going out and having physical sexual relations with perfect strangers that you've picked up on the internet. Mm-hmm. All of that is probably the end product of several years of secret, masturbatory pornography viewing that establishes the double life. And this is not something unique to the clerical ranks. This is a problem amongst the married as well, as many marriages have now dissolved and crashed and burned on the rocks because the husband in particular is addicted to that stuff.
Because it's a conditioning liturgy, right? It's a liturgy that enervates in almost every way. And I agree. I think so much of this is downstream. So much of what these sort of expressions are downstream from a kind of festering, hidden, liturgy, for lack of a better term.
I think this is one area too, not to stray too far off topic, but it's an important topic. And it was important to me as a teacher of undergraduates too, is that there could easily be a coming together here of church teaching and the modern psychological disciplines, in the sense that pornography is a deeply destructive mental health problem. In other words, I wish our government and our church would understand that one of the gravest mental health issues of our day, which is also therefore a moral issue, is pornography. I wish our government would designate it as a public health crisis. Because it is devastating. It has become so commonplace. It has become, you talk to young people today, it's just accepted. I would talk to my undergraduate, when did you first see internet pornography? Oh, when I was 8 years old. Right. Okay. This has a profoundly destructive effect on people. I have a priest friend, Father Alan Hoffa of the Diocese of Allentown, Pennsylvania, who has taken up now an anti-pornography ministry. Look at Matt Fred. Matt Fred, got started as a sort of anti-pornography kind of guy. And I think that our church needs to focus more on this issue. And I wonder, to bring it back to our conversation, if the reason why they haven't is that, and the reason why our congressmen and women haven't, is because they're all not all, many of them are indulgers in the same sin.
Sure. Well, and there's a tendency, right, Larry, to sort of just dismiss it as like, okay, like, come on, let's not get too worked up. Everybody kind of does it, right? I think there's this interesting unwillingness to sort of look at it straight, like what it's really doing, and I think that this is indication of a kind of a larger issue that I think I would love to pick your brain on. I know we're limited in time here, but just how liberal, again, I'm not talking sort of political terms, not in terms of like Democrats versus Republicans, but just how liberal the modern world is that it essentially preaches to us a kind of cozy agnosticism on the expression of preferences, right? So that, I really can't, hey, like he likes this, she likes that, like, well, who am I to say, right? That's why that comment was so profoundly powerful when Francis sort of does the shoulder shrug and says, who am I to judge? It's like, well, we have to find a way to address and reframe this notion of preferences as if like that is sort of who you really are. It's so important and vital that we recognize that your preferences themselves are given to you by your social imaginary. And the fact that our social imaginary is so saturated with pornography should give us all real pause.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. When people sometimes say to me, who are you to judge? I say, well, who do I have to be?
Right.
And, if I was a reporter on that plane, when the Pope said, who am I to judge? A more astute reporter would say, well, you're the Pope and you should be making certain judgments about these things.
Right.
Oftentimes when people say, who am I to judge or who are you to judge? It just masks, like you said, a certain insouciance, a certain cavalier attitude towards the whole question. Like nobody ever says that with regard to other sins. They only say it with regard to sexual sins.
That's interesting.
All right. And to say that with regard to sexual sins is to trivialize them. Say, oh, it's no big deal. Pelvic issues. I hate that phrase.
I know. Same. Well, all right, look, Larry, I got to bring this one to port. I have to go teach a class in just a minute, but I love getting together and talking with you. I hope that we can do this again once we get maybe closer to the conclave
I'd love to.
Or mid-conclave, because I think a lot of people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, are just really interested in this whole thing about how it plays out. I have spent my life Diogenes-like looking for an honest and reasonable man, and I love talking to you because I think that that's you. I think that you are one of those reasonable men.
From you, Cal. I appreciate it. And this is my first attempt at doing a podcasty type thing while I was over here because I wasn't certain about the internet, but it's working.
Perfectly robust, it looks like from my end. So, all right, audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I know some of you tuned in. It's early in the morning. We had to do it because of the time differences in my teaching schedule, but hopefully you can catch this on the replay if you didn't get it live. Until then, take care. God bless everybody. And we are out of here. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Underneath Podcast.